Here we're going to look at parallel and perpendicular lines and how we can tell if two lines are parallel, perpendicular, or neither of the two. So if we're looking at parallel lines, the one unique thing about parallel lines is that they are going to, they're never going to intersect. Right, so if we drew a picture of parallel lines, we'd have two lines that would kind of run next to each other forever, but they'd never touch. All right, and we use a shorthand symbol that kind of just looks like two parallel lines. So it's two little slanty lines, or actually segments, running next to each other. So that's just our shorthand for parallel lines. Perpendicular lines are two lines that do intersect, but they intersect at a very special angle. They intersect at a right angle, or a 90-degree angle, right? So if we're looking at perpendicular lines, two lines that are perpendicular to each other, they intersect here at a right angle, 90 degrees. And we just use an upside down capital T in order to shorthand perpendicular lines. So parallel lines are lines that have the same slope. They're the same steepness. All right, so they're going to continue increasing or decreasing at the same rate as the other one. Perpendicular lines are going to have opposite reciprocal slopes, okay, opposite reciprocal slopes. Okay, so opposite, we kind of want to think of one as being positive, one as being negative, okay, and reciprocals, that's where we're talking about really fractions, right? So if we have the fraction a over b, its reciprocal is b over a, and we have to meet both of these to be perpendicular. We can't have one or the other, we have to have both, okay? One thing that can help is if you have perpendicular lines and you find their slopes, when you multiply the slopes together, you should get a -1. So let's take a look at some lines and determine whether they are parallel, perpendicular, or neither. So the first step is always going to be finding their slopes. I'm going to find the slope of my first line and the slope of my second line. These are both in slope-intercept form, which means the slope is just the coefficient of x here. So the slope of the first one is 2, slope of the second one is 1/2. All right, so if they're parallel, they're the same. Well, these aren't the same, so they're definitely not parallel. If they're perpendicular, then they're opposite reciprocals. Well, these are reciprocals of each other, right? Because 2 is just 2 over 1. But they're not opposite, so they don't fit the two criteria that we need for perpendicular lines. So we would say that these are neither. They're neither parallel nor perpendicular. And we're just going to continue this pattern down the line. So in the second example, our first slope is a slope of 3. And if it helps, you can write it as a fraction. That helps us find reciprocals. So 3 over 1. Our second slope, this is point slope form. So point slope form always has the slope just right outside those parentheses. And our slope is -1/3. So the first thing we notice is one's positive, one's negative. They're opposites. One is a 3 over 1. One is a -1 over 3. They're reciprocals. So they're opposite reciprocals, which means these lines will be perpendicular. All right, next one. Now we're in standard form here. We need to remember that in standard form, we have to go looking for our slopes. We have to calculate the opposite a over b here for our slope. Okay, we'll scooch our window over a little. So our slope here, opposite a over b. So the opposite of a +2 is -2. Our b value here is a -4. So our slope is going to be a +1/2. Our other slope is much more straightforward because we're in slope-intercept form. Our second slope is going to be 2, or 2 over 1. So they are reciprocals, 1 over 2, and then flipped 2 over 1, but they are not opposite, so they can't be perpendicular, and they're definitely not the same, so they're not parallel, so these are neither. Neither parallel nor perpendicular. We'll go ahead and just box in our answers. You don't have to, but it helps to identify them. So let's keep going. Next set of lines. So again, we're going to work a little bit more with some standard form here. So my slope is opposite a over b, so we're looking for a and b here. So we'd have negative 3 over 5, and that does not reduce. The second one, this is slope-intercept form, so our slope is just the coefficient of x, negative 3 over 5. Our slopes are the exact same value, so we would say that these lines are going to be parallel. Okay, next one. We have point slope form, so our slope is always the value in front of those parentheses, or 4 over 1. And next one, standard form, so our slope is going to be opposite a over b. So do remember that even if there's not a coefficient of x, there's always a 1 there, we just don't write it. So this is going to be negative 1 over 4. If I'm looking at these slopes, one's positives, one's negative, so they're opposites. One's 4 over 1, one's 1 over 4, negative 1 over 4, so they're reciprocals, so these would be perpendicular. So remember, you have to have both of those things to be perpendicular. If you only have one, you're not perpendicular. Last example. So we have a standard form line for this first one. You can put your little ones in there for your coefficient if that helps. And we're going to find our opposite a over b. So that's going to be negative 1 over negative 1, which is really just 1. And I am just actually going to leave this as 1 over 1 because it's helpful to look at these as fractions. So our second slope is a negative 1, right? So it's in point slope form. So our slope is that value that we would distribute into the parentheses. And again, it's helpful to look at this as a fraction. So I'm going to put this over 1. So one is positive, one is negative. So we might be thinking perpendicular. But we might be wondering, how could we determine if these are reciprocals? Well, they are reciprocals of each other. It's just that when you take the reciprocal of one, it doesn't look a lot different because you're just putting one in a different location. So these are reciprocals, they are opposites, so these would be perpendicular lines. Okay, so you just want to make sure to find your slopes very accurately. Make sure they're reduced, writing them as a fraction, so putting them over 1 if they're an integer helps quite a bit, and determine if they're parallel, perpendicular, or neither.